So I don't think really in any dimension of this, there is no smoking gun per se. What there is smoke coming out of a lot of windows. You know, that's what I saw as I was reporting. There is enough smoke coming out of enough windows that we cannot take the lab leak hypothesis off the table. And so for me, the most credible people on this, they're not saying it was a lab leak. What they're saying is, why can't we have a full investigation? That's what we don't have. We have not had a forensic investigation. And so if we haven't had a forensic investigation, why are the scientists acting so unscientific by saying it wasn't a lab leak? How do they know? They don't actually know. Just like we don't know that it was or it wasn't. But there's enough of a suspicious fact pattern that it requires investigation.
Yeah, I of all the things that I have read, and I think at this point, I don't know what I haven't read. I feel like it's just so overwhelming. I think the most compelling...
Welcome to the club, yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I think the most compelling mechanistic answer, so there's lots of circumstantial reasons, right? The Occam's razor says, in the middle of fall/winter, so in Q4 of 2019, when there are no bats, they're all hibernating, you have a breakout in a major population center that's doing research on it. All of those things aside, from a purely biological mechanistic standpoint, I think the most convincing piece of evidence for a lab leak is that for about a year post this virus being in humans, it didn't change. We're only now seeing variants of this virus, right? Like the Delta variant you mentioned earlier. That strikes me as interesting, given the ubiquity of this virus, so how many people were infected, suggesting just how stable this thing was by the time it got into humans, meaning a lot of the tinkering got taken out of it sooner. Now, so one argument would be, if this were a virus that got manipulated and naturally selected through humanized mice, which is to say mice that have ACE2 receptors in their lungs, which are the exact mice you would use to do this type of research. In fact, the mice which we know were being used for this type of research.
Yes.
That makes sense to me, that, you could easily have a virus that has now reached its state of maturation. It gets out now into, the wild. And it takes quite a while to evolve into its new variant. What about you? Where does that stack up in terms of biological reasoning in favor of a lab leak versus not?
So, one scientist, Alina Chan,
she's at the Broad, right?
Yeah, she's at the Broad Institute, and she has really advanced that idea and had a preprint paper to that effect, which is the idea that this virus seemed immediately ready to infect humans and didn't appear to undergo the sort of all the early mutations that you saw in SARS-CoV-1, right? So it seemed sort of primed for human transmission, which in her view argued for a lab leak. But then you have scientists on the other side of that who say, actually, if you look at this strain, this is not maximized for human infectivity. If you were going to set out to create this in a laboratory to maximize human infectivity, this isn't it. So I think those are, again, two competing versions of this.
But they're saying very different things. I don't think that Elisa Chen is her name?
Alina Chen.
I don't think her argument is that it's maximized in its potential. I think, if I'm understanding her argument correctly, it's that it's reached a steady state. It's in an equilibrium. And I think that's a very different argument to the one that's being posed in the other direction, which is that, oh, well, if you were going to make this, you could make a much better job. I think that maybe gives a little too much credit to scientists. Like, it's sort of like saying, well, when those bombs dropped on Hiroshima, I mean, they were good, but they weren't as good as they could have been. I mean, come on, they could have been way more lethal. No, I mean, like,
I have to say it is sort of a red herring argument because, okay, so let's say it's not like the perfect bioweapon to infect all of humanity overnight.
That wasn't its intended purpose.
Right. The credible people who talk about a lab leak are not necessarily saying it was a bioweapon. It could be the accident of a sloppy, a moment of momentary lapse.
Yeah. So again, I've always found that argument to be completely nonsensical because one, it's if we believe in the broad idea of gain of function research, it's not bioweaponry. Two, even if you say, well, no, but if you're going to go to the trouble of doing gain of function research, you should try to make the most virulent, deadly strain imaginable. Okay, but are you going to make that in the first, let's assume it takes 100 steps to make that. And what happened if we were at step 60 when this leak occurred?
Right.
Does that mean we weren't on a path to making it better? So again, to me, that argument is meaningless, actually.
Right. There are a lot of red herrings in this debate.
So given all this sort of loose smoke that's sort of diffusing from the ground out of windows here and there, how would you think about trying to synthesize the arguments that most favor the consensus view that this virus occurred naturally versus the contrarian view, for lack of a better word, that this virus emerged from a lab? What would you say are the most compelling features that favor the former?
First, let me just say that I actually don't think there is a consensus view at this time. I think the consensus has been shattered and the scientific community is really divided. That said, I think, the strongest argument for a zoonotic origin is the precedent of previous SARS outbreaks, SARS-CoV-1 and MERS. And you look at those and those are SARS outbreaks that have a zoonotic origin that has been identified, right? So it would make perfect sense that this is the big one. This has come on the heels of those outbreaks. And you add into that, you don't have any specific smoking gun evidence to contradict that, right? Even though a host animal has not been found, an intermediate animal has not been found. So I think those, that in and of itself is sort of the most basic argument for it.
And to build on that, really, SARS-1 traveled something like 900 to 1,000 miles from its original site using two intermediary hosts. So to your point, the argument that, well, if this originated in a bat in a cave 1,000 miles away, there's no way it could make it to this populated area. No, that's not true. It certainly happened in the past, right?
It certainly has happened in the past, but let me just say that is added to the mystery here because, what people are saying is, well, if it started in southern China in Yunnan province, why don't we see a trail of infections up to Wuhan? We don't. So it looks like Wuhan in central China is the origin of this outbreak. Why? Right? So the original theory was there is a host animal and it could have been a sample at the seafood market in Wuhan, but no, all of this testing has not turned that up. So, in order to account for a natural origin, you have to find a way to argue how in the dead of winter in central China, in a market that didn't sell bats, didn't have bats, at a time when most bats are hibernating, how do you have this outbreak? And then you look at, the Chinese scientists themselves were like, oh, we know where it came from. It came from these labs. Two Chinese scientists very early on in the outbreak posted a preprint paper saying, well, we surveyed the area around the seafood market, and there are these two laboratories that have all these bat samples, so we think it came from them. And that preprint paper was immediately taken down. But, you have this problem of how to account for how it started in Wuhan.
Now, again, to go back to evidence in favor of the zoonotic origin, it could be, because I don't think anybody disputes that the bats weren't transmitting it to people in the fall or winter. I think everybody agrees that by the time September, October, November rolled around, the bats themselves would have been in hibernation. So the probability that a bat directly transmitted it to a human in, say, November, December, exceedingly low. Of course, the bats could have passed it on to intermediaries before then, and or the bats could have transmitted it on to a person or persons before then who didn't really become that ill, but somehow managed to make their way to Wuhan, correct?
Yes, although there is a wild card in this, which is that the virus in many cases is asymptomatic. So there are people who are arguing for an even earlier origin than we knew.
Such as the summer of 2019.
Right. Like Dr. Redfield is one of those people who has said that he thinks the origin is actually a lot earlier, and that it's very hard to pinpoint a date because of the problem of asymptomatic transmission.
Right. And, you got to take a step back and remember what it was like circa May of 2020, when the very first papers were coming out looking at seropositivity, suggesting that the case fatality rate was, infinitely lower than it had been previously identified. So, when we were first thinking about this as, oh my gosh, like 2% of people or 8% of people who are getting this are dying. And it's, the realization was, no, it's, 8% of people who are wildly symptomatic are dying, or, and the more we began to test people, the more that number began to fall. But it wasn't until serology was being done on asymptomatic people. This was done in Santa Clara, a very controversial study by John Ioannidis. It was done in New York. You basically began to see, look, this has got a lethality of about 1 in 1,000 people infected. So if you then extract that back to China, like there's a scenario in which 500 people are infected, none of whom really get sick or think anything of it beyond, it's a regular cold. But someone threads that needle of getting up to Wuhan. So that there's at least a plausibility of bat to human to Wuhan in that time frame, correct?
Correct. That is right. Yes.
If that were the case, it would still be interesting to identify the bat of origin, but it sounds like that's not happening yet. So let's chalk that up to first on our wish list, right? So if we were creating a wish list of how one would get to the bottom of this, it would be a full court press to identify, to do basically an amazing prospecting exercise to look for the bat host potentially.
But just to say, that in a way has been done.
Right. It's potentially what's in the database that was taken out in September of 2019.
But even since the COVID outbreak, and so that is post-dating what was in the database, there has been a huge hunt and widespread testing of wildlife samples. I mean, there has been a big hunt for the host animal, which has not been found. And
has that hunt been carried out mostly by Chinese scientists, or has been a worldwide effort?
I mean, it's been a worldwide effort, but the Chinese authorities have tested. I mean, the count and the WHO report talks about this. Something like 80,000 animal samples have been tested in search of a point of origin, and has not been found.
Okay, so then on the heels of that, another scenario is that a bat infected an intermediary, which either infected humans, or another intermediary, which ultimately infected humans. Several of those animals have been proposed, and several of those animals could have existed at the Wuhan market in the winter, still alive, not necessarily kept in the most sanitary conditions. That seems like a very viable scenario. And the biggest challenge to that is that very few stones have been left unturned in the search for what those animals might be, and yet that has turned up empty-handed.
That's exactly right. That's right. So, that is a very logical scenario, except that there's no evidence for it. That's the problem.
Other than precedent.
Correct. Yeah.
So I just want to make sure I'm not missing a scenario. Is there any other scenario that involves this virus infecting people having not been to a lab first?
One thing that has been talked about is the people who live around these bat caves, who have had exposure, who have tested, positive in larger numbers previously for SARS antibodies. But you still have the same problem of if that is a possible origin, is a natural escape in location in southern China to villagers who live around those mines. How does it get up to Wuhan without leaving a trail of infection that could be documented? Right. That's the problem.
Right. So then on the other side, we have a scenario where researchers are identifying this virus by identifying its original host, and themselves get infected through that, bring the bats or the virus itself into the lab. And early in their tenure with these animals, or with the virus rather, there's a contamination. I mean, I really think of these as two sides of the same coin, which is gain of function versus no gain of function research. But nevertheless, the virus has been brought into the lab. I mean, that's basically the other side of this coin.
That's right.
The most compelling argument for that appears to be, at least to my reading, the contrapositive of what we just said, i.e., it's the absence of either the original bat or the intermediary host, coupled with the argument made earlier about the relative lack of genetic drift or mutation once the virus took hold in 2019, in late 2019. The stability of the virus, basically.
I think here, first of all, there is a lot of precedent for a lab leak, as we've seen. I mean, there is a long history of this. There is a proximity argument, which is why Wuhan? Well, here are these laboratories that have the largest collection of bat samples really in the world, who were doing some of the most aggressive testing. So, there's that smoke coming out of that window. We know that they were doing aggressive gain of function research in which they were manipulating pathogens. And we also know that they were doing it not just in a BSL-4 setting, but in a BSL-2 setting. And then you do have the Alina Chan argument that, you do not see the sort of wide range of mutations initially in transmission that you did with SARS-CoV-1. So I think there's those arguments.
Yeah, and I guess you could almost break this down into two arguments, which is, what's the likelihood that this virus was brought into or created in a lab versus what's the likelihood it escaped. The second so you could break this down into two probabilities. Probability that this virus was brought into a lab, and then really a third one, probability that this was manipulated in a lab, and then probability that this thing escaped or could have escaped. Well, so if that's P1, P2, P3, P3 is like close to 1. That could be taken as a foregone conclusion, meaning the probability that a virus in a lab can get out is very high.
Yeah.
We know about the bad ones that have happened, but what we don't know is how many times has, research been done on a virus in a lab that is of totally no consequence to humans and it gets out. I mean, we wouldn't know about it, but that could happen all the time. So if you're, supposed to be functioning at BSL-4, and by the way, I mean, I'm not saying this to sort of pick on the people doing it. BSL-4 is a miserable environment. Like, you couldn't pay me enough to be a viral researcher working in a BSL-4 environment.
Right.
I would rather be painting roofs with tar in July than I would be working in a BSL-4 lab.
Right.
So can totally understand why there's a natural human inclination to take shortcuts with procedure there. So I almost think of like that third step of, could this have escaped the lab, as of course it could have. So it's really just a question of, what's the likelihood that this thing made its way into a lab and got tweaked? And that's where you get into these other questions of, boy, the people who claim it didn't aren't doing themselves any favors in the way they're acting. The EcoHealth Alliance, the Lancet paper doesn't look good in the light of day.
No, it does not look good. Which is back to one of the groups that I talk about in my Vanity Fair article is this group that calls themselves Drastic, which are these scientists who are independent researchers scattered around the globe who became, curious about this, obsessed by this, wanted to get to the bottom of it. But, and I interviewed a number of them.
How many of them are anonymous versus identified, by the way?
There's a handful who are anonymous, and I did not write about any of those who were anonymous who I didn't speak with, because you really cannot assess the agenda of someone who is anonymous and you're not interviewing. I mean, you don't know whether it's, Steve Bannon hiding behind a pseudonym. So, but, for example, the Indian researcher who calls himself the Seeker on Twitter, he's a science teacher in Eastern India who was the one who uncovered this Chinese master's thesis. I was able to interview him. A lot of those people I interviewed, they said the same thing to me. I got into this because I wanted to know why the scientists were acting so unscientific. Why do you take a hypothesis off the table without evidence, right? If you're having an investigation, don't you pursue all hypotheses in an equal fashion until you have real evidence? And in fact, the World Health Organization partnered with a group of experts who went to China and were basically sort of led on this, highly restricted tour by the Chinese authorities, and issued a report in which they said, the lab leak hypothesis is highly unlikely. I obtained a US government analysis of that report, which said, the report is essentially ridiculous. It concludes that on the basis of no evidence. And in fact, one of the lead researchers on that expedition was Peter Daszak of EcoHealth Alliance. So, there has not been a
Wasn't Peter Daszak the only American brought in? Wasn't he the only American scientist brought in?
Mm-hmm. Yes, he was. So there has not been a neutral, conflict-free forensic evaluation of all possibilities of origin at this time.
This podcast is for general informational purposes only and does not constitute the practice of medicine, nursing, or other professional healthcare services, including the giving of medical advice. No doctor-patient relationship is formed. The use of this information and the materials linked to this podcast is at the user's own risk. The content on this podcast is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Users should not disregard or delay in obtaining medical advice from any medical condition they have, and they should seek the assistance of their healthcare professionals for any such conditions. Finally, I take conflicts of interest very seriously. For all of my disclosures and the companies I invest in or advise, please visit peteratiamd.com/about, where I keep an up-to-date and active list of such companies.